most of you probably know, I'm David Plines. I'm the Assistant Director to the Walker Center, and I'm very excited about the programs that we have going this year. We've introduced 2 different kinds of faculty fellow programs, and one of these is the faculty fellow in program development, and that is 1 person in a year, and that this year is Karissa Peyer. She is the first, so it's kind of a pioneer trailblazing this program where it gives an opportunity for a faculty member to step aside from a little bit of the teaching to focus on some broader programs of and make a contribution to the pedagogical efforts of the university. And we also have a faculty fellow program in course development, which is a cohort of 12. Chad's among that crowd. And that has been an exciting thing as well. It's an 8-week program where faculty fellows in course development work on a lot of different major aspects of their teaching and build things to be used in the future. So these new programs are very exciting, and I'm pleased to hint that there will be a summer cohort for the faculty fellow in course development. We've just gotten some approval to move in that direction, and as we morph some things, we'll make more announcements as we go. So today, though, I want to turn the reins over to Karissa Peyer, who comes to us from HHP. Many of you will probably already know her. We had a very successful run with several weeks in a row, a book club on critical thinking with Adam Grant's book, Think Again, a sizable group in conversation thinking about what is critical thinking and many of the practices associated with that. Well, now we continue with a couple of concentrated workshops. And the first of the workshops is today. So for the last couple of weeks, and well, for many months, but the last couple of weeks especially, Karissa has been focusing on quick wits, short critical thinking activities. I also want to put a plug in, though, also for the second workshop in the series that's coming up in a couple of weeks called Good Thinking, semester-long projects to build critical thinking. So today, short activities, but it also can be built into a semester-long project. And if a person hasn't attended today, but you think they might benefit from this, please encourage them to look for the announcements. We'll keep putting out announcements and registration. But without further ado, thank you so much, Karissa, for these exciting programs. And I'm glad everyone can join us for this today.
Thanks, David. And thank you all for being here. I wanted to start with a little background of why critical thinking was the topic that I chose when I applied to be the faculty fellow, and kind of why we're starting with this quick wits approach. So for a number of years, I helped out in the Walker Center with scoring the critical thinking exams that some of our students take every year. If you've experienced that, it is a unique experience. If you have not, a little bit of background, these are standard tests. So they're not multiple choice, but they are very carefully scored. There are very clear parameters for scoring these generally short answer questions, but they put students in a number of scenarios where they need to figure out what information is applicable to a question and sort through how that needs to be applied. And there are often students that are very impressive, and there are often others that make us wonder how they got here and what they've been doing. And so I think if you've been in that room, you've thought maybe we could do a little bit more around critical thinking. We also know that employers say that critical thinking is an important skill that they're looking for in graduates. So we certainly don't want them to get through UTC and not have been exposed to this skill set. And then finally, it felt to me as somebody in a little bit more of I would call it a humanistic science area. So I teach in health and human performance. My area of specialty is physical activity promotion and health promotion. It felt like I was in this middle ground where I wasn't in an area that was philosophy and political science, where critical thinking seems to be so hands-on and applicable. And a lot of the examples we see come out of those areas, and maybe English and literature. It feels like, I think for my students, that there are often correct answers to things, but there needs to be nuance to that and to how that's applied and to think through scenarios in more depth. And so I felt like critical thinking was an area that really could be expanded. And I felt like this could be integrated similarly in other curriculum areas across campus that may find themselves in kind of that middle ground where it's not a right or a wrong answer, but the big expounded discussions, like philosophy maybe aren't happening of how can we still give our students these skills. So critical thinking skills may be harder to elicit in these areas, but I think that if there's some creative thinking, we can find room for critical thinking. So my goal for today is to share some ideas on how these brief activities can be adapted into your class regardless of the topic area. I do want to emphasize this is not a critical thinking course, but ideas for how to add critical thinking to your course. So we'll start with a little bit of background on critical thinking, but I want to give you an example of this in my field before we get into some of the definitions. So as I said, I am in the exercise science realm, and most of us know that exercise is good for our health. Physical activity guidelines say that adults should get at least 150 minutes of moderate exercise or 75 minutes of vigorous exercise or some type of combination of the two each week. And yet, often I will have people share articles with me or ask questions. Well, what about running or really strenuous activity? Is that really a good idea, or is there some risk in that? Unfortunately, it is not unheard of. It is rare, but it's not unheard of to hear about people running marathons or Ironman and having catastrophic events. And so people ask, well, no, that's maybe just too dangerous. I'm just going to stay on my couch. And so if I were to ask my students to do a Google search for running and risk or bad or something like that, these are some headlines that they might come across. Marathon running, an unhealthy addiction, striking health risks of running, and 13 serious health risks from running marathons. So if you look at this, you're like, oh, no, that idea was right. I am not leaving my couch. It is safer here. But if we Google search for running and benefits, we get very different headlines. So 6 weird perks of being a long distance runner, 11 amazing health benefits, 74 more benefits. And so when this type of contrast can occur, details are important. How do we get our students to think more deeply, especially when they may so easily become focused on knowing the right answer for an assignment or a test? They just want to know what is the right answer. We want to tell them, well, it depends. That there are caveats to a lot of these topics, and that we want to encourage them to take some more time to think about all of the different aspects of these types of questions. So let's look at some definitions of critical thinking. The Foundation for Critical Thinking defines critical thinking as the systematic evaluation or formulation of beliefs or statements by rational standards. Rational being key there. Pieces of this, a set of information and belief generating and processing skills. So these are skills, and skills must be learned and practiced to be developed. It is also the habit based on intellectual commitment of using those skills to guide behavior. As we get into critical thinking, and especially the idea of challenging our previously held beliefs and constructs that we have, it can be hard sometimes to force ourselves to put those skills into practice. We may have developed them, but there is 2 steps here: developing those skills and then actually putting them into practice. There are a number of different lists that you can find for basic critical thinking skills. Sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 7, and sometimes the terms are slightly different. But this model does seem to be a pretty consistent one. So we're going to talk just briefly about what do these different skill areas mean and what are some examples of what these tasks might look like in your class. So interpretation, analysis, evaluation, inference, explanation, and self-regulation. Starting with interpretation, this is skills such as categorization, decoding, and clarifying meaning. It might be asking our students to recognize a problem and describe it without bias, asking them to distinguish the main idea from a text, constructing a tentative categorization or organization structure, giving them a list of items and asking them, how would you put these into groups? Or clarifying the meaning of a sign, chart, or graph. So looking at information and decoding it. The next skill is analysis. This includes identifying similarities and differences between two different approaches to a solution, examining those ideas, isolating a main claim made through an article or an editorial, and tracing it back to supporting reasons for that claim, analyzing the arguments to really deconstruct ideas. Evaluation. This is where we get to assessing credibility of a speaker or an author, looking at information and determining whether the evidence supports conclusions that are being drawn, recognizing whether an argument's conclusion follows with certainty or confidence from its premises. So is there a logical strength and credibility to what we're reading or viewing? Inference is identifying the implications of a position someone is advocating for. So kind of following that thought line and seeing or conjecturing about what might come next. Predicting what will happen in a given situation, developing plans to gather information, and scientific experiments and hypothesis testing often fit into this category of inference when it comes to our critical thinking skills. Finally, our last two, explanation. Can we describe our methods and our results? Can we construct a graph or a chart to organize findings? Can we cite the evidence that led us to accept or reject another person's position on an issue? For faculty, something that often falls into the explanation skill is, can we list the factors that were considered in assigning a final course grade? Our last skill, and I think the one that kind of forces us to put all of these other ones into practice, is self-regulation. Checking for understanding without injecting our own views. So are we simply understanding what an author or a speaker is presenting to us? Reminding ourselves to separate our personal opinions and assumptions from those of an author, and reconsidering our interpretation in view of new information. For those of you that may not have been able to join us for the Adam Grant Book Club, I think most people's favorite takeaway from that book was, there is no benefit to me being wrong for longer. Nobody wants to be more wrong. We might not want to admit we're wrong, but if we are wrong, we have to admit it in order to be right. So finding those places where we are maybe off the mark a little bit helps us to take a step towards being right. So some aspects or characteristics of a critical thinker that I thought helped kind of put all of this into practice. A critical thinker raises vital questions and problems, formatting them clearly and precisely. They gather and assess relevant information using abstract ideas to interpret that information effectively. They come to well-reasoned conclusions and solutions by testing them against relevant criteria and standards. They think open-mindedly within alternative systems of thought, recognizing and assessing their assumptions, implications, and the consequences. And they can communicate effectively with others in figuring out solutions to complex problems. To put it side by side, critical thinkers versus uncritical thinkers highlight some of these differences. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but if we pick out a couple, critical thinkers can regard problems and controversial issues as exciting challenges, whereas if we're afraid of that critical thinking, then we see those as nuisances or threats to our ego. Critical thinkers strive for understanding, they're curious and patient, and are willing to invest time to overcome confusion, while the impatient would rather remain confused than make the effort to understand. A few others, critical thinkers can practice restraint. controlling their feelings rather than being controlled by them and thinking before acting, whereas uncritical thinkers tend to follow their feelings and act impulsively. And I think any of us looking at this list would prefer to be in the column on the left-hand side. We would like to believe that if we are not yet meeting all of those characteristics, that we could. And when we look at our students, I think we, again, would all agree that we would prefer that they fit into that left-hand column than to the one on the right. So what I want to do next is introduce a couple different activities. These are going to be relatively vague. I will give you kind of an example of each of these three in practice, but I just want to introduce them. And then we're going to have time for breakout rooms for you to practice picking one of these and thinking about how you might adapt it for a specific course of yours. So our first example activity is explain to an alien or explain to an extraterrestrial. So the student or you selects one course concept, and they have to explain that to someone who has just arrived on Earth. They have no prior knowledge about how Earth works, and we need to check to eliminate any assumed understanding. There are a lot of things that we take for granted, especially as we get into upper level courses, that everybody just understands how this works. And so the goal of this activity is to encourage your students to take a step back, start from the beginning, and see where we may have maybe jumped to some conclusions or assumptions. When implementing this in your classroom, you may have a conversation over what is allowed in that explanation. Am I allowed to act things out? There may be certain courses where being able to work through charades is going to be more helpful than if I am limited to words only. Of course, if this is done as a written assignment, then words only is probably what you're left with. So these are things that will not come up probably in your classes, but examples of things maybe at your next party that you could try to explain to someone that has never experienced Earth before, or specifically maybe some of our cultural traditions. So I have a dog who I love very much, but how would I explain the fact that we take what used to be wild animals and they live in my house, and she does not help pay rent, and she does not go grocery shopping or wash the dishes, but she gets to live here for free? The hiccups, I think, is very interesting. And again, in the more physical science side of things, breaking down to, what is really happening at a physical level in some of these activities or events that we take for granted. So activity one, taking a concept in your class and asking your students to break it down and explain it at a very basic level. You can do this as an interactive activity, either in pairs or in bigger groups where you have team human and team alien. And team human is going to try to ask some pretty basic questions. So you might say, well, dogs used to live in the wild, but now we brought them inside. Well, what is inside? Where do you live? What does that look like? Things that we assume everyone would know, but that if you're not from here are going to need some explanation. So again, taking high level concepts that I know we have areas in our program that by junior or senior year, students just get used to, and I encourage them to go home and explain that to grandma at Christmas, and you'll realize just how much you have learned because grandma won't know what you're talking about. So this is another way of approaching that type of activity. Our second activity is comparing facts and opinions. I know there are lots of quotes out there about, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts, and that we all have to agree on a set of facts. And so this activity is going to challenge students to do that. So you can either come up with your own list of statements, or you might ask students to do this for each other. And then their task is to separate statements into facts and opinions, which seems relatively straightforward. But I know in some of my classes, something that might make it on the list are common misconceptions in the area of health and wellness. And so you may have similar things in your classes. What are the things that students are most commonly doing wrong when they're applying concepts or taking an exam? So again, a pretty easy level of fact and opinion statements here. So these are not color coded to match fact and opinion. It's just contrast. So rabbits are mammals. That's a fact. We can establish that. Adele is a great singer. Might argue is also a fact. Others might say that's an opinion. It is, of course, actually an opinion. And so a follow-up to this piece is, what is the discussion that you have about what students need to distinguish a fact from an opinion? Something like running is the best way to improve fitness might sound like a fact if you could find a research study that showed fitness increased. My opinion is the best type of exercise is the type that you will do. I don't care if it's running or swimming or walking your dog. It's going to improve your fitness only if you actually do it. And so while we may have studies that show exercise or running increases fitness, that doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. So what evidence are you asking your students to look for to be able to say that something is a fact? What are the different criteria that they can use? Personal experience? Or does there need to be more to back that up? So there can be a follow-up conversation to this of how did you decide what was fact versus opinion? Our final activity will come generally later in the semester or later into a project when students have already developed some type of initial solution to a problem or have developed a stance or taken a stance on an issue. We are then asking them to evaluate what assumptions they had in place when coming up with that solution and make sure that those assumptions are either valid or that they can course correct to come up with another approach. So this is just a series of 5 questions that you would pose to your students. So what leads you to that assumption? Why do you think it's correct? What might happen if you are wrong? What are the uncertainties? And what are the disadvantages? We're going to assume that at this point they have already argued some of the advantages of their approach. You're asking them to now look at the other side of that possibility. This comes out of a scenario presented in the Think Again book at NASA and how assumptions were made that the way we have done things is the way that they should be done. And then bad things happened and those assumptions needed to be reevaluated. And so our goal is to get students to reevaluate their assumptions before a catastrophic multi-billion-dollar space shuttle issue. So one more lighthearted example, NFL football came up a lot in book clubs. So my assumption, my solution to some NFL issues is that the NFL should adopt college football overtime rules. If you're not a football fan, in the NFL, if a game goes to overtime, there is a coin toss. The team that wins the coin toss gets the ball first. If they score a field goal, the other team then gets the ball. But if they score a touchdown, the game is over and the other team does not have a chance on offense. In college, both teams get a chance on offense. There have been a number of high-profile NFL, particularly playoff games in the last few years that have gone to overtime and ended after the first team scored a touchdown, with the second team never receiving the ball. Been some upset fans. So if I were to process this assumption, what leads me to this, playoff games in recent years have gone into overtime and were won by the first team to possess the ball. Why do I think my solution is the correct solution? Because I think giving both teams a chance on offense seems more fair and balanced. What happens if I'm wrong? Angry fans. If we change this and then it doesn't come to a solution that works for everybody, or if you're a fan of the team that in the old rules, the other team wouldn't have gotten the ball and you had scored a touchdown and everything was good, and then your opponent does score a touchdown because I said they get to have the ball now, you're gonna be pretty mad at me. I'm gonna have some toilet paper and eggs in my house. Might also have some angry owners. There's a lot of money in the NFL, and so changing the rules can impact some bottom lines there. What are the uncertainties in my analysis? I don't actually know if final outcomes would be any different with a different system. The flip side to this argument is that defense and special teams are a part of football too. You should be able to defend your goal as well as you can score. Possible disadvantages. In sport, the longer people play, the higher the chance of injury. And so I am taking what may have once been a one possession overtime and increasing the likelihood that it goes longer. And so there is an increased chance that there would then be injuries. Okay. So we could apply this same process to solutions that students have developed in your course. What we're going to do now is create some breakout rooms. I want you to pick one of these activities that you think could most easily or most interestingly be incorporated into one of your courses. And we're going to put you in breakout rooms with people interested in the same activity. We're going to have 10 minutes probably in breakout rooms for you to bounce ideas off of each other. Here's what I'm thinking. Here's how I would do it. And then we'll come back to a big group and share some of these ideas. So what we're going to ask you to do is if you go to your own picture on Zoom and hover over your own picture, it will pop up in the right-hand corner of your picture, a blue box with 3 dots up on it. If you click on those 3 dots, there is an option at the very bottom of the drop-down menu to rename yourself. We're going to ask you to add a 1, 2, or a 3 to the front of your name. Add a 1 if you want to work on explaining to an alien. If you want to work on a list of facts and opinions, add a 2 in front of your name. And if you want to work on evaluating assumptions, add a 3 in front of your name. And this makes things organized nice and easy when we go to create breakout rooms. So again, 1 to explain to an alien, 2 for fact versus opinion, and 3 for evaluating assumptions. And while we're working on that, any questions about any of these activities before I kick you out to your breakout rooms? All right, looks like we've got a couple 1s, couple 2s. Dunstan, you might be on your own with number 3 there.
I'll do number 3. I can change.
You want to work on number 3? Excellent. And if you are not in the classroom much, if you're more of a project administrator, you could certainly think about how would you do these in a project? What assumptions on a project do you want your employees or partners to be evaluating?
All right, so I'll go ahead and put you all in these rooms. So just setting those out. This is a little trick if you don't know about this in Zoom. One way to set up groups is it's very when I'm doing it manually, but I put these numbers in front and I say I'm going to run the rooms manually. It has organized all the 1s and then organized all the 2s and the 3s, so I don't have to look anywhere else, and I don't have to depend on Zoom doing anything other than just letting me see those numbers. And now I've already set it up, so we have our rooms. So let's go off for 10 minutes and think about how this activity might work in your class and discipline, and what are some of the considerations that you want to think about if you need to modify. And we'll come back in 10 minutes and talk about these things. So here we go. All right, so we have had a chance to hear some things about critical thinking, learn about a few activities, and try out some ideas on each other. Where do we go from here, Karissa?
I'm going to start with room number 1 because I like to go in numerical order. I'm curious what concepts room number 1 came up that they might ask their students to try to explain to an extraterrestrial.
So I teach our law and ethics class, communication law and ethics. And I've never thought to ask the students what the First Amendment means. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to ask them to explain the First Amendment to an alien.
Or a voter. Anything else out of that room?
This from the same person who also uses a mannequin as her example. So,
well, they could, okay, so they could explain it to Quinn.
They could be related.
I suggested that students work through the concepts of theory and method.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I don't know.
Well, what we were running into in the class I teach is that I asked my students to analyze a media text. I'm in communication, like Shirley knows, and so I asked them to sort of break down an episode of a TV show and ask them which theory they would use from what we had just read. And the response by vast majority was critical theory, which is a really broad and body of theory with way too many concepts to use in any notable way. So what I was looking for was to try to figure out a way to take the concepts of maybe, body of theory down through method or approach down through smaller concept and see if they can break them down in that way. By the time we finished talking, though, I began to wonder if we should just ask students to define what a book is, and then work through the actual book and the structure of the table of contents, because I think some of the same ideas would come out if you were to start there.
Explain a table of contents. That might drive some more of like, I'm going to put important things in the table of contents instead of every page in the table of contents. Right. I don't think it's a bad idea.
I'll jump in. Don't worry. KP, I got you, girl. So I work with freshmen for a living now. It is a blast. And really, I think a question I would love for them to explain is, what is college? I think that could lead to some really interesting discussions. And then also, what is health? Because Dr. Peyer and I typically get a hold of students juniors and senior year, but I think if we can get freshmen to start thinking about health and it's not just physical health, I think some really cool conversations could occur there.
I agree. That sounds great. Carolyn?
And the last one. I work with a lot of interns in special collections. And so in order to get them to write better reflections on their experiences in special collections that might help them relay that information accurately in, say, a job interview or graduate school application materials or something like that, I'm thinking about adding this kind of component to their reflection assignment so that, they get something that they can show off when they leave special collections, in addition to the work they actually do.
Yeah, I think just, at least I've seen in students where they're explaining an experience, but they're often assuming that somebody else knows how it worked or, knew more detail about it, that would explaining it in a, application letter would really strengthen the story they're trying to tell. I like that idea. I spent some time in room number 2 and we maybe strayed off topic a little bit, but does anyone have any fact versus opinion ideas to share?
Well, we really didn't get into what we would actually do. But I teach in criminal justice and I have some critical thinking, what I hope to be accurate critical thinking exercises where they look at news articles and try to determine the facts of what we're seeing, what they really are. And we cover a lot of current issues with defunding the police and Black Lives Matter. So giving them information out there and having them determine, like, is this fact because I read it in the news or on Twitter, or is this really what people are advocating for? And so giving them different snippets of that and maybe making them determine, maybe they wouldn't know up front, but having them work through it together more. It's like a group activity and say, okay, let's look this up and see what that means.
Yeah, I love that. I think the other thing that came up in that discussion was maybe we need to retitle this fact versus hypothesis. Of we throw the word cause around a lot, of X causes Y, but do we really know that? Or do we think it does that? Mary was telling us all about spurious correlations between swimming pool deaths and Nicolas Cage movies and helping students look at, how do you know that? There you go. Mary.
Okay, I put the link in the chat so y'all don't think I'm over here proposing this as actual fact. I was just going to say the table that you gave, I think even if somebody didn't want to use it, create the boxes themselves, they could take your boxes, show students how the activity works, and then, like you suggested, let students come up with the boxes, and then maybe they trade off, small groups trade off. I have a topic in my class about how the media represents families. And so I think that would be a great activity. You know, what ways are they realistic and what ways maybe are they not? They love any kind of example where they talk about their favorite family on TV. So that would fit right in.
I'm noticing a common theme of TV. That's how we get them. How about room 3? Assumption evaluation. What happened in room 3?
I think Dunson's looking at me and I'm looking at him.
Yeah, well, we were talking about how we initially were thinking about our teaching caps, but then we were thinking about other venues where this activity would be really well. And one thing that came to mind for me was about some policy changes that we have coming soon in the library, with people with kind of varying levels of experience at some of the service points, and like having some exercise where everybody kind of walks through not only what their perspective is, but how they got to it, and like what the consequences of that being wrong, testing those assumptions, I think would be a really good exercise just for figuring out how people got to what they were thinking, rather than what is the conclusion that they're trying to sell everybody else on. So I think I'm kind of excited about trying this out. Maybe not every day that I say I'm excited about trying something in a meeting, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I agree. 1, I'm going to order the book. 2, I think as Dunson shared, thinking through some of those assumptions. So both of us teach, but we wear that administrative hat too. So there's a number of projects that we're always pulled in and on. So having the opportunity, instead of just kind of bringing people together and saying, tell me what you think, to go through a series of questions that really test our hypothesis, test assumptions. And I think Dunson had mentioned as well, what's the evidence if we're wrong, and the evidence maybe even if we're right. So I'm looking forward to implementing this framework in the future.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things we can look at that this is the way we've always done it, but why? And maybe if we look through that process of those assumptions, we can find a way to do a little bit better. So yeah. Awesome. Well, before we wrap up here, I have just a few more slides I want to share of some just thoughts and question stems and things like that about critical thinking. And then we'll kind of tease you into the next workshop. So I found this diagram and I thought it was just a good synopsis of things to look for in our classrooms if we are implementing critical thinking. So things like emotions separated from reason, inquiry driven rather than curriculum driven, students asking more questions than the teacher. I know that that's something I'm always wishing I could get more, questions coming from the students instead of me just peppering them at them. So there's some room for improvement there. Revisiting, updating, and revising questions. Unpredictability, that we want an unpredictable classroom. If everybody's thinking critically, we don't always know where it's going to go. And that questions are valued over answers. Again, coming back to that, well, it depends. What do we need to look at? What more information do we need, rather than just feeling like we got to an answer, we can turn in the assignment and we're done. The next couple slides use slightly different groupings for those critical thinking skills, but I thought this was a really helpful way of separating them out and kind of the specific skills we're looking for. So it aligns a little bit more with Bloom's taxonomy of what are the skills. And then I really like the question stems. So if I'm trying to create an activity focused on organization and comprehension, I might ask what differences exist between these two things, or writing an outline. Application, how is something an example of a concept or of a theory? And then for our last 3, an analysis, what are the parts or features of a specific topic? What solutions would you have for synthesis? And then for evaluation, asking them to prioritize things or identify criteria for assessing whatever it might be. The one thing that I want to mention is that coming soon, it's not there yet, so we don't have a URL for you yet, but we are going to try to incorporate all of these ideas into a website so that you don't have to remember everything here, but also so that things like these last few slides with all of these question stems that you certainly aren't going to remember, you can find those somewhere else. So we're looking at this to be a repository of existing resources, so links to other websites and books. I can guarantee you Think Again will be the very first resource listed on that website, the book we did for book club. We're also in the process of producing short, what we're calling, at least right now, 2-minute teaching tips, summarizing these activities. So the first 3 that will be up on the website are the 3 that we went through today, but we've got a lot more that we're building out. The recording of this workshop will be on there, and then there will be a separate page for the next workshop coming up in 2 weeks, I think. Is that right, David?
That's right.
That will look more at how can we build semester-long or long projects that focus on critical thinking without spending the rest of our lives grading. So it's not going to focus quite so much on the actual critical thinking skills themselves, but we'll look at examples, but more about how can we structure projects so that we can ask for this type of effort by our students without being afraid of what it's going to do to our load on the feedback side and grading and things like that. So look for workshop number 2. We've got a few minutes. Any questions, David? Any closing thoughts from you?
That's right. Certainly any questions. I'm grateful that we've had the opportunity with the Think Again book, and I encourage you to get that book. I think I have a couple of extra copies. So if a couple of you just pop me an email, I might be able to get you a free copy there.
Monty's got dibs.
So get me the email and we'll get back with you. So the book's available and that got us started. If you weren't able to attend, you can still benefit from that. The workshops are, as Chris is saying, are leading also down to a set of resources. So she's put together already some very short 2-minute videos on various techniques and is developing a number of other videos. So there'll be some kind of teaching tip videos that describe the techniques. The resources and links will be available, materials for you. So this whole semester is working its way through the material, the ideas, but then just as you see today, becoming very practical. I encourage you to attend and get the word out on the next workshop. As you all know, teaching one-shot things is important because we need to know how to fit these things in, but building over time is really a challenge. And I really want to hear how I can grade less. So if there's a benefit to that, I want to hear it. So the bane of our existence. So let's see where we go with this. Thank you so much, Karissa. Any last questions or comments before we head out? You have some thumbs up there and a few of our applause. All right. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you all so much for your time.
Very exciting to be able to get a chance to do these things with you all. All right. We hope to see you again.